right, thanks again, Mike and Lori. We appreciate the partnership. If you weren't able to be with us this morning for our half-day conference, we had a great turnout and great sessions. Started with Senator Tom and Bob Moore, and then we had sessions on education, the hot topic of healthcare, transportation, environment, right to work. Is it right for Washington State? Environment, and small business. So if you weren't able to watch that, your local cable station, Charter Cable, has been taping the entire program, and then we're also doing this conference tomorrow in Bellevue. It's a statewide summit, so we're doing one event in Eastern Washington and one event in Western Washington. So we're holding this program with almost all the same speakers, including our keynote speaker, tomorrow in Bellevue. So you can watch it live on our website. We're going to stream it live at washingtonpolicy.org. So if you or somebody else wasn't able to be here for the conference, I encourage you to watch it that way. I just want to thank some of our sponsors. You heard about the Chamber's sponsor. We've had sponsors of our Solutions Summit as well, so I want to recognize them. Some of our statewide sponsors, Pat and Mary Ellen Hughes, Primera Blue Cross, Regions Blue Shield, Walmart, Washington Trust Bank, and then several local folks from here in Tri-Cities. Bob Tippett is a member of our board here. Tippett Company is a sponsor. Sensky Lawn and Tree Care, Mickey McKinnon Insurance, Bill and Meredith Fairness at Waddle and Reed, the Home Builders Association of Tri-Cities, the Northwest Cancer Center, Tri-Cities Journal of Business, and the Yakima Valley Business Times. So please join me in thanking all of our sponsors of our conference. If some of you are new to the Washington Policy Center, that'd be your first event of ours. You should have got a folder when you came in. There's a lot of good information about the organization. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank with offices in Seattle, Olympia, Spokane, and right here in Tri-Cities. Our office is just up the road in Pasco. Jason Mercier, who runs our Center for Government Reform, is our full-time staff person here in the Tri-Cities. So we take our mission of a statewide policy organization very seriously, and we have an Eastern Washington Advisory Board as well. So more information is in this packet. We have a new magazine that's coming out today called Viewpoint, and I hope you'll pick one up on your way out at the information table. Before I bring up our speaker, I want to bring up Senator Sharon Brown to introduce him. We've had a great partnership with Senator Brown over the years when she was Mayor Pro Tem of Kennewick, and she worked closely with Chris Cargill in our office on several issues, and it's great to have her in the state Senate. She was appointed earlier this year, and she just won her re-election in a real squeaker by 75% of the vote last week. So congratulations. So come on up. So again, she was just re-elected last week, and former Mayor Pro Tem of Kennewick, and as a lawyer here in the Tri-Cities. So great to have you with us. Thanks.
What a pleasure it is for me to introduce today's guest speaker, Mr. Scott Rasmussen. Most people know of Scott's work at a company he founded called Rasmussen Media Group, a highly regarded news and public opinion polling organization. But Scott has done so much more, including authoring numerous books, earning him a place on the coveted New York Times best-selling list. He's also hosted TV commentaries on Fox News, CNBC, and let's not forget BBC. Additionally, he has traveled all over this country to deliver speeches relating to public opinion, business, politics, and lifestyle issues. In his book, appropriately titled In Search of Self-Governance, Scott noted that American people do not want to be governed from the left, the right, or even the center. They want to govern themselves. In 2003, Scott founded Rasmussen Reports and served as its president until July 2013. Within 6 years of its founding, Scott led the firm to become the most visited public opinion website and the most searched for source of public opinion data on Google. That's huge. Earlier in his career, Scott and his father founded ESPN. The Wall Street Journal calls Scott a key player in the contact sport of politics, And to my fellow friends from Olympia, there's no contact in politics, is there? The Washington Post adds that he is a driving force in American politics. I doubt there is anyone better able to communicate to us what people in America think today. So without further ado, let us welcome Mr. Scott Rasmussen.
Well, thank you. Sharon doesn't admit to it very often, but she is a Jersey girl. And we talked a little bit about some of those earlier years before I got to get up here, and now I'm going to embarrass her with it. But no, I won't say anything more. I'm actually delighted to be here because of the name of this summit, a Solutions Summit. There's an awful lot of policy groups and a lot of organizations that talk about the things they want to accomplish, but putting solutions in the title is the most important thing that you can do, because most Americans don't really care about ideology or policy or what the government is doing. They are looking for ways to solve problems. It is something that is a challenge if you are a policy group, because you want to sell your ideas, but the people you're trying to sell them to want to hear, how am I going to take care of my health care issues, or how am I going to get my kids educated? And you need to bridge that gap. The way that we do that in America is something that ties into our passion for self-governance, and it's something that's been a part of our cultural DNA going back to the very beginning. There was a young man named Levi Preston who on April 19th, 1775, joined several of his friends at Concord, the day that the shot heard round the world was fired to begin the American Revolution. Many, many years later, when he was 91 years old, a historian went to him to ask what it was that motivated him to stand up and fight for his country. And he said, were you oppressed by the Stamp Act? And the 91-year-old Preston said, nope, never used no stamps. Okay, were you offended by the tea issues? Nah, didn't drink tea, and from what I know, the boys dumped it in the harbor anyhow. So then the historian said, well, you must have been influenced by the writers, and he listed different writings and theories that people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison would have debated. He said, nah, the only thing we had in our house was the Bible. So what was it that made you go out and fight? And he said, we were always free, we always wanted to be free, and the British meant to end that for us. It was a very simple perception that was part of the common attitude among the colonies. And if you want to succeed in American politics, you have to tap into those basic attitudes. If you're a policy group or a chamber of commerce, you're focused on how can we get our policies passed or our candidates to win in the next election, our policies passed in the next session. And sometimes you're tempted to say things that might get you in trouble. President Obama is finding that out right now when he talked about if you want to keep your health insurance, you can keep it. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. He would have been better off not making those promises, having the bill not become law, or having some smaller version become law, and winning a larger battle. If you are fighting for free market ideas, you need to make sure that you don't sacrifice them in a particular election, that you don't say things that are going to come back and haunt you. If you've just passed charter schools, you want to make sure the schools work. You don't want to end up making promises that you can't keep. The reality is that in America today, nobody cares about limited government. They only care about the kind of society that a limited government can create. And that's what you want to talk about. You want to talk about the society that you're creating and back it into your ideas and how that works. And people are going to measure you not by your words, but by the way the programs pan out. Now, I want to put this in a little larger context. 2013 has been kind of a fun year for my family. My older son just got engaged, so I'll be an in-law next year. It's a big deal for us. My youngest son just graduated from college, so we have no more tuition checks to write. That, too, is a big deal. And as my wife and I were contemplating our empty nest times, we decided it was time to start a new business, the Rasmussen Media Group. I did leave my polling firm in July. And there's lots of reasons that you do these things, but basically it's because of opportunity. And whether you're in the political realm or in the business world, it is defining the opportunities that helps you make your decisions. Sharon mentioned that back in 1978, my father and I had this crazy idea for an all-sports network called ESPN. And I can tell you all kinds of silly stories about all the stupid things we did that make it happen, and I can explain to you that the reason ESPN exists is because we were too stupid to know it couldn't be done. But the reality is, ESPN exists because there was a new technology in 1978. I'm not going to embarrass you, but how many of you remember the days when there were only 3 television networks? You know, and back in those days when the President of the United States spoke, we all watched him because the networks canceled all other programming until he was done. Jimmy Carter had a much bigger audience when he spoke than either George W. Bush or Barack Obama, because now we have other choices. Well, it was satellite technology that changed all that. We knew in 1978 what it cost to send a signal around the state of Connecticut via traditional landlines. We found out that via satellite we could send the same signal around the entire country for less money. That is what shook things up. ESPN came in 1978, CNN in 1980, and several others fell quickly after that because of this new technology. A little over a decade later, in 1994, I founded my first polling firm and website, and it was not because I wanted to, just start polling. It was for a lot of reasons, including the fact that there was this new thing called the Internet. And if I told you what I thought the Internet was about in 1994, you would laugh at me for being really stupid. We put something up on the site, we tried it out, but I did find out that we looked exactly the same on the web as Gallup, and that you began to feed an audience in a different way. And obviously it had an impact for me, but it had an impact on the lives that all of us lead. Right now, we're going through another change as big as those two. This is the first year in American history. All of you who had your hand up a moment ago remembering 3 networks will be shocked by this. First year that more people watched video on a computer or a mobile device than on television. Just think about that for a moment. There was a survey done of youngsters asking how much television they watched, and the average was very high, and the researchers were shocked because the stories are all about how young kids don't watch television anymore. It turned out they said, well, sure, we're watching television. We watch it on Hulu, we watch it on our phones, we watch it on our iPads. This is a dramatic shift in the way that the world works. If you are taking part in the contact sport of politics, you have to engage and recognize these changes. And there's one other big change that's happening in the nation. These are all a big part of it, but it has to do directly with the political world. Government in America does not drive the political process. Society does. Government follows along. Government adapts after the fact. And traditionally, government is about a decade or 2 behind what is happening in the rest of the country. Let me just ask a quick question. How many of you can tell me the year that women first voted in the United States? Give me a guess. Okay. Did anybody guess 1869? Women were allowed to vote in Wyoming in 1869. Now, Wyoming is known as many things, but it's not a very progressive state. So why did they let women vote way before anybody else? Can you guess? And this will be another shock. Men will do anything to get women to come hang out with them. There were no women in Wyoming in 1869. So you put together a marketing plan, you offer them all kinds of things, and, give them political rights. What's the harm? Starting then, for the next 50 years, whenever a group of men thought it would help to let women vote, might help with an education issue or a temperance issue, they gave them the right to vote. Washington State gave women the right to vote, not through the legislature, but through the referendum process or the initiative process. and California did the same year. It got to the point where a woman named Jeanette Rankin actually had the nerve to get herself elected to Congress before Congress thought she should have the right to vote. But it wasn't the fact that a woman showed up in the boys' club that led to the suffrage amendment. It was the fact that Congress was being elected with the votes of women. About half of Congress in 1917 was elected with the votes of women. They figured out that they better vote for suffrage to win the women's vote. And that's why you all think that around 1920 is the time women first voted, because Congress ratified what the nation had already decided, and then they took credit for it. This is the way change takes place. Society moves, politicians catch up. That is something in today's era that's especially interesting, because from 1776 until the 1970s, everything in American society moved towards more centralization. We went from delivering messages by the fastest horse in 1776 to the telegraph coming along, and then the telephones and wire services and radio and television, so that 90% of America was listening to one of three networks in the 1970s. Corporations were going the same way. We started having big steel corporations and big railroad corporations. This trend towards centralization led government to grow in the same direction. That's the reason we had a bigger federal government, because it was a free rider on the overall society. Beginning around 1980, American society began to move in the other direction. We are now more and more decentralized than ever before, because we all do have iPhones and iPads and different tools, but we all use them in different ways. While America is decentralizing in these last 30 years, the federal government has continued to grow and extend its reach, and this disconnect is the cause of all the tension that you see in Washington. It's not because of Barack Obama or Ted Cruz or any of the short-term players. It is because the government is moving in one direction and society is moving in the other. These tools, these digital revolutionary tools, are changing America because they are empowering individuals once again. There's a guy, Nico Mealy, who was Howard Dean's first internet guru. He wrote a book called The End of Big. It's a great book. He's very uncomfortable with the changes that are taking place, but he says that this is a radical redistribution of power away from traditional institutions. And he's exactly right. Because we don't get power through voting for people. I mean, it's good that we have the right to vote. I think that's a very important part of our Western heritage. But you really have power in a discussion when you have the ability to walk away. If you go to your neighborhood store and they don't treat you well, you don't have to go back. That's the way that we gain power. A great example of this was in Major League Baseball. Back in the 60s, players weren't allowed to leave teams on their own and become free agents. So the average Major League Baseball player in the 60s made $20,000 a year. Today, the average player makes $3.2 million a year. The difference comes because players can leave their team and offer their services to the highest bidder. When we have the power in our hands to make choices, if you don't like what Google did this morning, you can switch your search tool on your app to Bing. If you don't like what some other service does, you can change that. In this world that is very difficult for a political process to keep up. And that's the challenge that we're starting to face. That's the challenge that folks in Washington are really struggling with. Now, the way I describe this is to say that a one-size-fits-all government cannot survive in the iPad era. They either have to crush out all the creativity and all the choices that we have through these mobile devices, or the government will have to change. And I suspect the government will eventually catch up. So what does this look like in terms of politics? Well, there's been a lot of explanations about why Barack Obama was reelected or Mitt Romney lost in 2012. And most of it is pretty worthless. Barack Obama and Mitt Romney had an election that was really like the trench warfare of World War I. They were fighting about yesterday's issues. They were fighting to get their base out. Neither one of them had a really bright idea about how to move forward. At the end of the day, Barack Obama won not because of his technical advantages or because Mitt Romney ran a poor campaign. Barack Obama won because the economy got a little bit better. On the day that Obama took office, 35% of Americans said their finances were in good shape. On the day he was reelected, that was up to 39%, just barely enough to get him over the top. You know, it's possible Romney could have done better. It's possible Obama could have performed a little more poorly, but it would have taken a heroic effort to overcome the reality of the economy. That's what drove the election. And as we look ahead to 2014, there's only two issues that are really going to drive this election nationwide. One is the economy, and two is the president's health care law. That law is the greatest gift to Republicans that has been given to them in a very long time. It is going to keep rolling out in Republican favor as more and more stories come. And remember, you know, in consumer confidence studies, they always say one dissatisfied customer tells an average of 9 people about it. If you're a happy customer, you usually don't say anything about it, you just expect it. There are going to be tens of millions of people who are going to change their doctors or be forced to change their doctors or their insurance. Some of them will end up with similar plans, but they'll still hate the aggravation of going through it. That group of people very much is going to resent the way this law is being implemented. And so when you start to think about 2014, somebody told me the other day that if Republicans can get out of each other's way, it will be a good year for them. I think a better way to think of it is 2014 is going to be a good year for the Republicans. It's just a question of if they get out of their way, it'll be a little bit better. They'll certainly retain control of the House of Representatives. Don't know there'll be much change at all there. Republicans will almost certainly gain seats in the U.S. Senate, but it's not quite clear if they will win a majority. Ironically, that's the same thing we would have said in 2012 and 2010, but the Republicans did show a remarkable ability to elect stupid candidates along the way and cost themselves Senate seats. So we're still in that same dynamic. So if you're a think tank or a chamber and you want to start talking about small business issues or healthcare issues or education issues, how do you deal with it? These are things that are going to affect the next generation, but they don't really affect this upcoming election. What you have to do is tap into the same themes that are being talked about. You need to be talking about empowering individuals and finding ways to do that, and then trust that societal changes will bring about results that you'll be happier with. Let me give you a simple comparison. Right now, I'm told it costs about $11,300 per student per year to educate a child in Washington. You can buy a homeschool curriculum for $600. Now, not everybody wants to be homeschooled. In fact, we're probably nearing the peak number of people right now who ever want to be homeschooled. But that discrepancy between $600 and $11,300 per year per student is going to look like an opportunity to some educational entrepreneur. They're going to figure out a way to take things far beyond the choice offered through charter schools. I don't know what it's going to look like. I can envision a time when companies are setting up schools on their sites, or where people are getting together in different facilities and having schools that are based on a homeschooling curriculum and having different forms of people performing roles we think of as teachers right now. Again, I can't predict what that future will look like, but I know it will be a radically more different change than anything being talked about in policy circles. So if you want to see that kind of change, what you want to be talking about is putting the power back in the hands of parents, making sure they have control over their children's education. That's consistent with your charter school messaging. It's consistent with other things. You want to make sure these programs work. And then something big will happen. We're just not precisely sure when and how. In talking about the healthcare issue, by the way, I loved that the whole challenge effort you ran before. I have my own experience with that. I get up every single morning and prick my finger and put a drop of blood into a meter and check my blood sugar. And then I get on a scale and check my weight. And the first thing it does is it embarrasses me if I didn't eat well the night before. So the second thing is it means I don't do that as often. In a few years, I expect that all of us will be finding self-monitoring ways to take better care of our health. You can go into a drugstore now and you can buy tests to see what your cholesterol level is, if your kids are on drugs, if your wife is pregnant. Anything that we're starting to see right now is going to expand. And it has good results. I'm 20 pounds lighter than I was about a year and a half ago. Not in the same league with some of the winners today, but I feel pretty good about it. And my blood sugar has gotten so low that I'm no longer officially a diabetic anymore. Self-monitoring helps. But in 5 years or so, when we all start to do this and we start to send in through our iPhone app our blood test results to a doctor on a regular basis, the role of a doctor is going to change. They're not going to be seeing patients as much. They're going to be having some clerks doing variance analysis on your blood levels, and they're going to say, well, you had a pretty good month. We don't need to see you. Or, what are you doing? We need to have you come in. And if you begin to think through that change, it will upend the healthcare system as we know it today. The reason it will do that is the minute you change the relationship between patient and doctor, you change the entire chain. How are you going to issue prescriptions if the doctor doesn't see the patient on a regular basis? How are you going to begin to regulate some of these issues? What is it going to look like when you're doing your test yourself on your phone rather than going to a lab and paying $100 to have it done? These are issues that cannot be solved by political leadership. They're going to be solved by entrepreneurs. And if you continue to think through the path of where we're heading, how many of you have heard of the IBM computer Watson? It won the Jeopardy game. It's now studying every case history at the Sloan Kettering Institute, and they expect it will be able to do a better job of diagnosing patients than human doctors within a couple of years. There are expectations by some, and I don't know how reliable they will turn out to be, but that 80% of primary care physicians will not be needed within a decade. These types of changes are coming because people are not focused on policy debates or thinking that the Republican plan is better than the Democratic plan. It's because people want to improve their health. It's because people want to make sure that they are able to take care of themselves and their families. And as they search for new solutions, and we're thinking about it in an internet-connected world, we're going to look for different types of solutions. And again, this presents a huge challenge for anybody playing in this political arena right now today. Back in the 1930s, there was a Great Depression, and there's all kinds of stories about the New Deal and the heroic politics that took part in that. But I want you to think about it from a slightly different perspective. In 1929 and 30, Herbert Hoover took some actions, and Congress took some actions that converted a recession into a depression. Government policy mistakes created the Great Depression. So what was the policy response? We gave more power to the government to manage the economy. Now, that doesn't make sense if you say it that way. The reason that the American people in the 1930s gave more authority to the government about the economy was because ideas had been bubbling around for 20 or 30 years in the equivalent of state think tanks that had been advocating different things, the minimum wage and child labor laws and the need for unemployment insurance and concerns about retirement. They were selling solutions to problems that people were very worried about. So when a crisis came, the ideas that had been kicking around in the States for a long time came together as the New Deal. Some of them didn't survive. Some of them have lasted until today as our most cherished programs. But it is getting those ideas in circulation that made all the difference. And that's the same place we're at today. I'd love to tell you exactly when this big transition is going to take place and what a presidential candidate has to do or say to make it happen. Can't be done. But I do know if you get the ideas out there, change will come on its own. And as a final example, just to drive home this point before I take some questions, how many of you have a 401k plan? How many of you know that Congress never meant for you to have that? Okay. A few hands went up. That's encouraging. But in 1978, they passed a Tax Reform Act. And in the legislative summary of the bill, they listed the top 24 or so provisions of it. Things like reducing the top tax rate from 48% to 46% and raising the zero bracket a few $100s. Not once was there any mention of this pension plan. What happened was a guy named Ted Benna, a benefits consultant from King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, did something radical. He read the law. He read what they actually passed. And he found the provision in paragraph 401k that was probably miswritten. It was probably not what they meant to say. It was supposed to be you could put money in with your after-tax dollars into this thing, but that's not what they wrote. So he went, because he wanted to serve his clients, he went out and started selling companies on the idea. A few of them were afraid of government retaliation, but finally a few tried it. And within about a half a dozen years, there were 50 million 401k accounts in the country. That wasn't a change that came directly from the political process. It came because people were concerned about their retirement planning. There were things happening in society, and when a vehicle came about, an entrepreneur made it happen. That's the way change happens in America. And I would encourage you, as you're thinking through these issues, to remember that most of the people you're talking to are not going to be up to date on all the latest policy numbers. They're going to have their eyes glaze over if you start sounding like you're spouting rhetoric. Their eyes are going to glaze over if you continue to talk to them in ways that don't connect with the world that they live in. But if you can find a way to tap into their basic ideas, which I would call in America today the spirit of 76, the simple notion that we all have the right to do what we want with our lives so long as we don't violate the rights of others. If you can put your storyline into that mindset, it will travel very well. And it will have an impact far beyond the issues and the elections that you're working on right now today. I would say that as I look at the environment, whether it's 2014 or 2016, or no matter how you want to gauge the political spectrum today, that we're in for some tough and bumpy years. But I would also say without any hesitation that America's best days are still to come. Our country is going to be much better off in 10 or 12 years than it has been at any point in our nation's history. And I'll be happy to take questions about that or anything else at this time. Thank you very much. Now somebody's walking around with microphones. So if there's a question, we'll start with...
I'm getting pretty comfortable with asking that canary in the mine question, so other people will start asking. But Mr. Rasmussen, you give me hope, as does the Policy Center, with the thoughtful and get past the rhetoric and treat us like we have a clue. From the data you've seen in your experience, how would you suggest that we close the achievement gap in our education system? You talk about possibility and entrepreneurism, and that's enterprise. How can we get people re-engaged in what should be the best education system in the world?
You know, I think the question about the education system is really challenging today. The single best economics program in the world today is eBay. Young people learn about free markets because they buy and sell things on eBay. They're learning, they just don't know it. So when you say, how do you do that? Well, there's a couple of components. One, you have to get people engaged with the process, which means the education system can't be the way it was 20 years ago and just bring a computer into the room to change it. And secondly, there has to be a sense of accountability. and most of that will come from parental and community involvement. So you have to bring those two things together. I should point out, anybody here been to Monticello? Okay, Thomas Jefferson's place. If you look on the outside, there's a clock with only an hour hand. Because if you were on the plantation, you didn't really need to know what minute it was. Roughly the time of day, you could pretty much tell by looking at the sun was close enough in the 18th century. When Thomas Jefferson was president, he wanted to extend that vision all across the country. He wanted an agrarian society. A guy named Samuel Slater came over to America, who nobody remembers now. He's known as the father of the American Industrial Revolution. During Thomas Jefferson's time in the White House, Slater built about 50 factories. He began the factory system here. As Thomas Jefferson's ideas about education being made available to everybody took hold, the model that we know now as the schoolroom model, with the teacher up front and the kids in desks, came from Slater, because it was the factory model. And by the way, everything else that we know about our society, dads leaving home to go to work rather than working at home, the importance of the time management and a whole series of other cultural changes came because of somebody in the private sector who was doing something entirely different. I believe that what's happening right now is we're undoing what Slater began long ago. And how we do that in the education system is unpredictable except by somebody who's in that process.
What I was wondering is, I would always consider myself to be an eternal optimist. Most people that would know me know that. But the one thing that I think concerns me even more so is our national security. So when you say you're extremely optimistic about our future, how do you feel about our national security?
The United States right now spends as much on the military as every other nation in the world combined. And our allies, on top of our spending, spend more than our enemies combined. We have a global superiority that is unmatched in the history of the world. The question is, how do we use it? Most voters are very uncomfortable with heavy interventions. Most people don't believe we should get involved in foreign policy situations unless our direct national security interests are at stake. And we're struggling right now with how do you implement that? From a pure military point of view, we are unbeatable. But the battle is being fought in other areas. I think it's important that America talk about its idealism in international settings, but be a little bit restrained in actually pursuing things with force. I think it's also important that we remember that while we tend to think of Western civilization as having won a battle of ideas, most of the world remembers that we had the best guns when we took over various countries. So in a national security setting, I think the issues are more troubling with how we apply the power we have than having sufficient power.
Thank you for coming out. You said that Republicans were split, and I agree with that, but what's one major position do you think Republicans are split on that they need to unify, and what direction do you think they need to go?
You know, the Republican Party right now, the way it's often described, is a battle between the Tea Party and the establishment Republicans. And that may be a good way to describe what's happening. I would argue that the Washington, D.C. Republicans have no base around the country. They don't have any kind of following. The Republican Party, rather than one position, needs to find a way to articulate a positive message, and a positive message that is based on empowering people. It is not enough to say, we have to oppose the president's health care law because it's socialism, or because here's why it's not working, or because it's a stupid website. There needs to be a view that says, here's how we're going to solve the health, here's how we're going to take care of your health care needs. Here is the way to improve the system. Because it's a legitimate concern. And talking in those positive terms, talking in terms of solutions and futures is much better than sounding like you're fighting the battles from the past 30 or 40 years. Too many Republicans sound like it's almost like they say, we need individual freedom even if it hurts us, rather than saying we need individual freedom because it unleashes the creativity of the American people to solve the challenges before us.
What is your opinion on the national debt and what it's going to do to us in the next few years?
Well, my opinion on the national debt is pretty basic. It's way too big. But what scares me about it is it's even bigger than we talk about. I wrote a book called The People's Money, in which I pointed out that if you really add in all the unfunded liabilities that are out there, we don't owe about $16 or $17 trillion. We owe more than $100 trillion in debt. I mean, just think about that number. The problem is Republicans today say it's because Barack Obama's a big spender. Democrats today say it's because George W. Bush cut those taxes. And they're both wrong. The people to blame for the debt that we have today are Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. In the 60s, they passed legislation very consciously designed to win votes from people who are alive at the time and pass the cost off to some future generation. And we are that generation. And for those of you who think that's just an extreme statement, let me tell you what Richard Nixon did in his first term in office. He passed a Social Security law. There was a need to have some revisions in Social Security at the time. Somehow, he deemed it really important that every senior citizen get a letter from the President of the United States 1 month before Election Day telling them that he had just signed a law giving them a 20% benefits increase. And on top of that, he said, here are the long-term projections that show that it's financially sustainable. And for some, who knows what reason, unless you're a cynic, the projections ended the year before baby boomers started to retire. They knew in 1972 that the situation was unsustainable, but they passed it because it wasn't their problem. The way you need to address those things is not to pretend that you can fix them in 1 year, but to recognize that there's a whole series of, it's going to take a long time to work our way back out of it. Some of the issues are fairly easy. On Social Security, you can let people choose their own retirement age. If you want to retire earlier, you pay more in taxes. If you want to retire later, you pay less in taxes. And you can arrange the numbers to wipe out the entire unfunded liability in Social Security. That's a fairly easy one. Medicare is the next big part of the federal budget. That's a much more challenging issue because that's actually involved in providing services. And the only other big item in the federal budget beyond Social Security and Medicare is national security. Those three items account for about 2/3 of all federal spending. And we have to have a discussion about how much we're going to spend in each of those areas and how to implement long-term reforms, or else the system is simply going to be overwhelmed.
I'd like to turn the question back to education.
Okay.
I attended a one-room schoolhouse where the second graders taught the first graders how to read, and the fourth graders taught the third graders the multiplication table. Is that, in your mind, a possibility of the way for the future?
Yeah, I don't know that particular model. We're certainly not going to go back to a one-room schoolhouse, and the kids who are learning today are going to do it with an interactive technique. Will older kids be involved? Sure. But I don't know what the model looks like. I think I know there are people at places like Apple trying to figure this out, and there are other companies trying to figure out how do you make this happen. And it is almost to the point where everything that we can think of about the way schools are handled today is going to be rethought. And the only way it's going to happen is for some. I'm not an education expert, so that's not, I'm not the person who's going to figure this out. But somebody is going to say, wow, with these tools available and with these opportunities for bringing people together, there's going to be a new type of school. Let me give you an example from a whole different realm to maybe make the point. In Hawaii a few years ago, a bridge was wiped out. And it threatened the tourist season for people on one end of the island. And the state government said it would take $4 million in 2 or 3 years to finish. And the residents couldn't handle that because their business was going to be wiped out. But because they have smartphones and other ways to connect, they got together, they built the bridge themselves in a few months at no cost to the government. People donated the services, and they had a healthy tourist season that year. That would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. And if people can come together and build a bridge like that to beat the state government to the punch, somebody's going to think just as dramatically about the education system.
I have a question as far as...
Okay.
I have a problem with the term, and I think I'm a conservative, but I feel that one thing that gets people in trouble is that they talk about entitlements. And I have a problem with a person that is put into a system their entire life, and then it's called an entitlement. To me, it's like a wage. It's like, oh, And so I can understand, I do a lot with helping out the needy and things like that, that part of Social Security is really more of an entitlement. Who started that word, and how can we really call it what I believe the people that are going into retirement deserve to have it be called?
The phrase entitlement and also the whole concept of uncontrollable budget accounting came from a series of trends. They were formally codified in the 1974 budget legislation. And it simply means that you're entitled to these provisions by law rather than any other purpose. For example, there is no legal requirement for Social Security beneficiaries to receive their money. The government can stop those payments anytime they want to. They can stop the provisions. There is no trust fund. How do you go about fixing that? That's a huge challenge. If I were to make a single recommendation, I would start with something even more basic than talking about entitlements. It would be to say that when spending goes up less than expected, you still say spending goes up. You don't call it a cut. And you begin to talk about budget numbers in real terms. And when you talk about entitlements, if somebody says to you entitlements are the problem, ask them which entitlements they mean. What do they mean by that? Talk about real programs, because that's a different approach to it. It looks like we're running out of time here, so I want to close with just one thought, and that is a lot of times people who are promoting free ideas and free markets get so hung up on the freedom part of it and so hung up on the individual liberty part of it that they forget that most of us choose to use our freedom to live in community. The American people want to find ways to work together. And one of your challenges when you talk about solutions is to find ways to work together, just not always through the government. Thank you very much.